What's it like to host a cookbook podcast? What goes into a great interview? We could have asked ourselves, but we wanted to chat with someone who has been in the game a little bit longer. Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. I'm Kate Leahy, and today I'm here with Molly Stevens and Kristin Donnelly. Hey, everyone.
Hey, Kate.
Hi, Kate.
All three of us on the podcast. This is exciting. Today we're talking podcasts. I mean, we started planning Everything Cookbooks in the fall of 2021, and we launched in the spring of 2022. Now, believe it or not, we're in our fourth season, and looking back, it feels as though we've been doing this for a while, right?
It does. It feels, like 5 years?
So podcasts grow in dog years? Is that?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think it's because it's such a natural extension of the conversations that we were having already. You know, we've been talking about cookbooks for a long time. So, but yeah, the podcast, episode 65.
I think that's why it's going to be so fun today to geek out a bit about podcasts and cookbooks.
Podcasts and audio is such an interesting medium because I feel like you get to know the hosts. Like with some of my favorite podcasts, I feel like I'm like really good friends with the hosts. And then I realize I've never met them in real life. So there is this intimacy. So then when you have these like friends who are, quote, friends who are sharing an interview with somebody, I think that can mean a lot for an author.
We've found just since we've been doing Everything Cookbooks that podcasting seems to be more and more a part of an author's book tour.
Yeah.
We know there are less and less real tours, and so there's more virtual tours. But I think one of the things that's so sort of fascinating and exciting to me about the medium, and I know that, there's a lot of jokes about everybody and their dog has a podcast, but you can get the word out, but it can also be such a helpful way to learn about what other people are doing. Back to Kristin, your point, the intimacy of it is that people share their stories. Like to learn how different books get made is so interesting, or other people's journeys to become an author.
Yeah, and it's true. It's like when I'm really excited about a subject, I subscribe to like every podcast in that, subject field. So it's kind of like in some ways, I think it's the more the merrier, especially, say we only release our podcast once a week when we're in season. And then what am I going to listen to the other, 6 days of the week? So I'm pretty much, if I like something, I will subscribe to all the podcasts in that category. But maybe I'm a little crazy and I do walk my dog a lot. So
well, but also every host or hosts, depending on the format, they have their own point of view and their own characteristics. And so I think I go in and out. I'll be completely obsessed with a certain podcast because of their point of view, and then I might tire of that for a little bit and I'll switch to another one and then I'll come back to it. It's very interesting.
It really is. That's what's so great about today's interview is that we get to talk to somebody else who has a podcast, not only a podcast, but a cookbook related podcast. And we're going to geek out a little bit. We're going to talk about audio quality. We're going to talk about what makes a great interview. We'll talk about things authors can do to just be ready to have an outstanding interview. To do this, we're bringing on Brian Hogan Stewart. You might know him from his popular podcast, Salt and Spine, which is all about the stories behind cookbooks. He is in his 13th season of the show, which launched in May 2018. And he also runs the Salt and Spine Substack, which features recipes from cookbooks he features on the show. It's really done in a thoughtful way. This fall, he has some great guests lined up, and he's going to tell us who he has in store at the end of this episode. With no further ado, let's bring him on. Brian Hogan Stewart, welcome to Everything Cookbooks.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here and to chat with all of you.
We are really looking forward to this conversation because I think, Salt and Spine has interviewed more than 200 cookbook authors at this point. Is that correct?
Technically, that's correct. Yes, we've aired like 170 episodes or something, but we had a few that had, more than one guest. So over 200 cookbook authors that we've featured on our show. So
when and why did you launch Salt and Spine? Take us back to your origin story.
So I thought coming out of high school that I would become a chef. I was sort of dead set on culinary school. I applied, I was accepted, I was like all ready to go. And at the last second ended up getting a journalism scholarship that covered the majority of my college tuition. So I had this real moment as a 18-year-old of like, do I pursue culinary arts, which was kind of my passion at the time, or this other sort of passion, which was journalism, writing. And I made the decision that like mostly free college was probably the better decision in the long run. So I did that and spent like about a decade working in nonprofit communications, working with advocacy groups, working with political organizations, and enjoyed it, but still had this like real pull to food, to hospitality. I was an avid home cook, a avid cookbook collector. And it was really the 2016 election. I was working in politics at the time and working, 60 plus hour weeks, just had like poured myself into that. And the election happened. And I just had this moment of reflection of like, I've poured myself into this work, and it's at times incredibly rewarding to work in politics and at times very defeating too. And there was just this piece of my brain that was like, you have to do something with this passion for food. Like you're pouring yourself, you're exhausting yourself in this work, like give yourself some time to pursue this other passion. I kind of thought for a while, I knew that I probably wanted to do something on cookbooks. I'd had this real interest in cookbooks, this growing collection, and just wasn't sure the format it would take. And I'm not really sure how I landed on a podcast. I think I was kind of like in that moment. This is like 2016, 2017, where podcasts were really taking off. And like it was everybody, had launched a podcast for fun. So it was kind of like the thing to do. So it felt kind of right. But, leaning on my journalism background, my work as a journalist, my passion for home cooking and cookbooks, it felt like maybe this could kind of come together in some way. And so I spent like about a year putting together a plan, a pretty thorough launch plan, who sort of our first set of dream guests would be, what sort of topics we'd talk about, what segments there might be on the show, how we'd go beyond just the audio podcast to create more of an experience for home cooks. And then we just kind of hit go about a year after that.
Wow.
I'm so curious, and we really want to get to that list of dream guests, and also you say we and want, but I'm just going back to your love of cookbooks and your cookbook collection, and how this notion of having a conversation with cookbook authors, because we're, especially this season of Everything Cookbooks, we're talking a lot about community, and I feel like cookbooks are that's just hardwired into what cookbooks are. The best of them are a conversation between the author and the reader or the cook in their own kitchen. So this notion that somehow in reading all these cookbooks, you get this idea that, what if I could actually talk to these people in person?
Yeah, that's really what it was. For a while, I was like throwing around this tagline, like, we bring cookbooks to life, which is sort of cheesy, right? But that's kind of what the vision was. And when I was working in politics those last few years and got sort of much more into cooking because I needed an escape, I joined a bunch of online cookbook clubs. Like I was the Food 52 cookbook club, where they were doing a monthly pick, was really, I don't know how active they are these days, but was like really active in that era. And so I'd cook through a book with like all these folks online. And like, it just really felt like there was this opportunity to create something that didn't exist. There weren't really many other cookbook podcasts at the time. There are more now, like your wonderful podcast and a couple others that focus more on cookbooks. But at the time, there weren't really many. So I was like, how could we have conversations with these authors and build some sort of sense of community? And my sort of journalist brain was like, these are just content troves, right? Like people pour so much of their knowledge and their insight and their creativity into these books. And like, how can we harness that sort of to like showcase interesting things that didn't make it onto the page, or why these decisions were made, or how the books even come together in a lot of our conversations. So it really sort of was that idea of like building community through conversations with the author, and in a way that now we're competing against so many people. There were always platforms, right? Like Bon Appetit's YouTube channel existed, which was just viral already at the time. But there's so many places now you can hear conversations with cookbook authors. So we're always trying to think about how to keep it fresh. But it felt like there was an opportunity to create an intimate, in-depth conversation with authors in the podcasting space.
Yeah.
That's really interesting what you're saying too, because I'm thinking you're burned out from all the work you did on the 2016. And it's like this devastating sort of pivot moment where now it's time to find something, a different thing you're passionate about, a different part of your brain. And then, you could have decided, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to write my own cookbook. But instead you looked at it from a different standpoint and were thinking of more of this conversation. So that's kind of, did you ever think that's what I want to do? I want to go to culinary school now. This is my chance. I want to break. What other things could you have done?
Oh, yeah, there was definitely that culinary school thought, right? Like just entirely pivot, right? Like just quit my job, leave politics, go to culinary school. It sounded sort of really appealing at the time, to be honest, to just wash everything away and focus on cooking. But, I didn't really think too much about writing my own cookbook. I sort of, I'm not professionally trained, not that you have to be to write a cookbook by any means, but I sort of was more interested in tapping into the brains of all of these authors and looking to cookbook authors as experts in their own right. So that was really more of my thinking and less of like, what could I produce in terms of an actual cookbook? I wanted to produce other types of media.
Podcasts in general, they're just such a great opportunity for authors because I feel like people who listen to podcasts also read or they buy books, right? So
Sure.
Whenever there's like a new podcast, I love to scroll back and find like, what was the first thing? And I didn't realize actually until I did this that with Salt and Spine, Nigella was the first guest.
She was our first episode. She wasn't the first
episode,
conversation we recorded. So we recorded 10 episodes for the first season and she was maybe 3 or 4. So she was up there, but she was the first episode we aired.
That's pretty sweet. And how did you just ask Nigella?
Honestly, yes, it was. People ask me this and I'm like, I guess I write really great cold emails. Like it was all just cold emails.
That's a skill.
Yeah. And, I did spend a year like putting this plan together. So when I was reaching out to guests, we didn't have anything to show in terms of an audio product, but I had a lot to show in terms of the vision, the plan. We had a name, we had a logo, like we were kind of ready to go. Yeah, we had 10 guests in the first season, all from Cold Outreach. We had Nigella Lawson, we had Jacques Pepin, we had Samin Nosrat, Diana Henry. Just like I was kind of beside myself. I remember the moment like Jacques Pepin's confirmation email came in my inbox. I was having lunch with my grandma, who was a big influence on me as a cook. Like I spent a lot of time at her house as a kid. We watched the older Food Network a lot. Like The Two Fat Ladies was her favorite show. So I was having lunch with her and I like the email and I showed her and we were both kind of like, I can't believe this is really happening. So
pinch me
it was
moment.
It was very much a pinch me moment. Yeah.
Salt and Spine it's a great name, and it feels so established now because it is. Did you play with other names? I'm just curious.
Oh yeah, we had a whole list of other names, probably at least 20 that we were sort of seriously toying with. And Salt and Spine came kind of at the last minute. I can't even remember how it came about, but it was one of those, like, you're sitting on the BART train or something and it's just like, oh, it should be Salt and Spine. And sometimes I do still have to explain to people, like, spine of a book, right? Occasionally we're like, is this a medical thing? Or,
oh, God.
What does the spine mean? Right.
Well, it's funny because we talk a lot about book spines.
Yes.
Paul Forbes recently. Yeah, Spines Out.
Exactly. But to, someone who's less sort of in tune with cookbook publishing, they're sometimes like, what is the spine? But yeah, it just kind of came to me out of the blue and it felt great and it's punchy and it stuck. And I think I'm still pretty happy with the name. So
yeah. And you do keep saying we.
I do.
Yeah. So tell us about the we.
Yeah. So, well, sometimes I'm very guilty of using the colloquial we. I had a producer when we started who went to journalism school with me, also was living in the Bay Area at the time with me. So, and, we were doing everything in person still then. And now we're sort of like hybrid and trying to move back as much as we can. But so for the first couple of years, her name is Allison Sullivan. She was our producer and really helped like build the vision for what Salt and Spine would be and get it off the ground. And then we've had a couple other producers since. Madeline Forbes was with us for a while. And then Clea Worster has been our producer for the last, I want to say like close to 2 years now, maybe a year and a half. And it's fun. She'd moved to Germany recently. So she's was in the Bay Area and moved to Germany. So now we're international team as well, which is super fun.
My understanding is that all the interviews were originally in studio, and I don't want to say live because they were recorded, but they were in person in studio. And you use the word hybrid. So you seem to be moving away from that or mixing it up.
Yeah, we were fully in person until the pandemic, essentially. So we would only take guests who we could record in studio here in San Francisco. And that was sort of core to the idea at the beginning, right? I felt like there's an intimacy that you get with in person that you don't get sometimes virtually, or it's harder to establish that virtually. And then obviously the pandemic happened and we had no choice. Authors weren't on tour, authors weren't traveling. And it also caused us to reflect a little bit at the time on perhaps that it was a bit exclusionary. Authors don't have a lot of funding. Often the publisher is not footing the cost of a book tour. So it may be self-funded if they are on tour. So there are authors maybe who aren't able to invest in a book tour. And so we weren't even considering them because they weren't coming to San Francisco. So it was just a no. So we've been reflecting on that the past couple of years. And then we went fully virtual during the pandemic. Initially, we were like everybody, we're like, well, this will last a couple of months. We'll be back in studio before you know it.
Oh, yeah.
And then we hit that moment where we're like, no, okay, if we want to keep producing content, we've got to go virtual for recording. And just before the pandemic, we had started an event series as well. So doing live shows with a live audience. Sometimes it's a dinner party with a podcast conversation. And so those are back too. We've done, I think, 5 or 6 in the past 9 months. This year, we did a beautiful one at Hog Island Oyster Company right on the shores of Tamales Bay, which is like the most beautiful place I've ever recorded anything. So it was super fun. So now we're sort of continuing to keep some hybrid approach in there, just knowing that like there are people we want to talk to that we just might not be able to get in person. So the preference is still in person, but it's just a different world post-pandemic, if we can use that phrase. So
I was just thinking back to when you graciously had me on and my co-authors, John Lee and Ara Zeta, to talk about Lavash in 2019. Molly, I probably either beat you or came after you in the Civic Kitchen. One of the things was that we gave you no notice. We're like, we're here, interview us. And you're like, I haven't even seen the book yet. So you're very gracious. But another thing that struck me was just the expertise you had to have in all the technical setup. I mean, the audio quality was amazing. I mean, just, full disclosure for all our listeners, we have never recorded in person. We do it virtually. We, have an ad hoc system that we've figured out to make it work. But I remember thinking, whoa, podcasting, this is really like, you got to have all this gear. You have to know what you're doing, the audio. And I was really impressed. How much time did it take to learn all that stuff?
Yeah, it was definitely a learning curve. And when I landed on the podcast idea, I think I'd thought about like a website and then the podcast thing happened. I'm like, I have no experience in audio. Like I'd done some work in broadcast. I'd done some broadcast journalism. I'd done some like online broadcast stuff, but I'd never done audio. So there was a bit of a learning curve. Not to like make it sound easier than it is, because certainly like it's work to make sure the audio records well and like there's all the post-production stuff, but audio is very forgiving. We've played around with video a bit for Salt and Spine, and I'm also not a pro video editor, but like video is so much less forgiving. You can, make edits and cuts in audio that nobody ever hears or notices, and you have to do a lot more work to hide that sort of editing in video, right, with transitions or different camera angles or things. So that is one thing I learned pretty early on, is that audio is forgiving. And we, now just like the technology has advanced so much. I don't know if you all use Descript to edit, but it's an audio editor that sort of also functions like a Word document in some ways, and it's a much more visual based editing tool than some of the early audio tools we were using that only rely on waveforms, and you have to kind of spend a lot of time tinkering. So like I think partially because podcasts took off so much and audio has become so big, the technology has moved quickly to respond to that. So it's been really helpful, but we do try to make professional sounding quality audio, and it's a lot easier these days than it was.
How do you find the guests that you want on the show? Do people pitch you? Do you pitch them? Is it a combination of all of those things?
It's definitely a combination. Early on, we were just doing cold emails and trying to get people to become aware of us. I think you all know, and probably many of your listeners know, the publishing industry is a pretty small industry in terms of the number of publicists. There's a lot of consolidation that has happened. So it's at this point, we're pretty connected to most of the major publishers and some of the smaller ones that produce cookbooks that we would be interested in. So now it's kind of more of just a two-way conversation each season in terms of which books are coming out and who we're interested in and who's going to be coming to the Bay Area for an in-person conversation, who can we do events with, is now a big piece of it for us. So it's a lot of that sort of, they pitch us, we pitch them, we have a conversation, we figure out how it fits into our broader programming. And we've tried to integrate some more thematic content. So, when we started, everything we did was just one-on-one interviews with cookbook authors. Nigella has a new book, so we want to go deep with her about that book, her career, her life story, all of that. The first time we sort of started producing thematic content was when everything happened at Bon Appetit and the test kitchen and the magazine. And we started to think about the ramifications for the broader food publishing industry, for the cookbook industry. I mean, these conversations were happening elsewhere too, right? And, who was getting cookbook deals, who wasn't. There was a lot of conversation there. So we did a 4-part series on equity in the cookbook industry and the food media industry that, to date, those are some of our most downloaded, most streamed episodes. And, those were now 3-4 years ago at this point. So
these were some of the episodes where I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, but where you would bring on, there'd be multi-part episodes. So you might interview several different authors or different people involved in cookbooks.
Yeah. So instead of just one-on-one interviews, each of those had a focus. One was focused on what happened at Bon Appetit and sort of reflecting on that. One was focused on representation in the cookbook industry. So we talked to a couple of agents. We talked to some publicists. One was focused on the next generation. So we talked to some up and coming food authors like Rahana Bisrat-Martinez, who we talked to several years ago, and her first book just came out this year, which is beautiful. So that was kind of the first time we tried that different format of not just a one-on-one interview with an author, but can we tackle a theme? We just had a live show a few weeks ago here at the Mill Valley Public Library on the state of California cuisine today with Rima Seal and Tanya Holland and Sarah Kavolsa Olsen. So really interesting mix of perspectives on what does it mean to be a chef in California? How do those things translate to cookbooks that are being produced from California authors? So we're continuing to try and play around with those different formats. They're a lot more work when we talk about
I was
audio
going to ask
editing.
you about that. Yeah.
Those reported pieces, and especially if you're doing 5 or 6 interviews with different people at different times and then have to weave them together, it takes a lot more. But we also saw, from the metrics that people really responded to those and they performed really well and people listened to them. So we're thinking about how to integrate more types of content like that too.
It's interesting. Do any elements of the live events make their way into episodes?
Yeah, we put a mic in the audience. So we want to capture, cheers, laughter. It's a fun event for people who are in the room, but if you're listening at home, we want to make it feel like you're there in the audience and part of the live show. And then we typically take audience questions and either integrate those into the podcast episode, or sometimes we put those as a bonus piece of audio up on our Substack. So we try to bring that live atmosphere to the podcast waves as much as we can.
Tell us about Substack actually and how that supports what you do on the podcast.
Yeah, so for a while we were using a audio hosting tool that inserted digital ads into the show as a way to try and produce some revenue from the show. And then I want to say about 2 years ago, we made the switch to Substack and no longer have ads in our shows and are just listener supported now. From the beginning, we've always wanted to have content beyond just the audio podcast, right? So we've always had excerpted recipes from any of the books we feature or other sort of bonus pieces of content, right? We often will record an excerpt with an author reading directly from the book. So it's not part of the interview episode, but you can go online and hear them reading a passage in their own voice, which can be really lovely. We just recorded with Viola Buitoni, who actually read a recipe. It's the first time we've done that, but she had a sort of,
so great.
a narratively structured recipe. So she suggested that, and I'm excited to share that. We put those things behind a paywall, essentially. So we always have had a 7-day trial on the Substack that's been active for anybody forever. So you can always test it out. We have hundreds of recipes at this point from these featured cookbooks. So we like to think of it as an added value for our community.
You love everything cookbooks, right? Well, we love making it for you. And if you'd like to help keep us going, go to everythingcookbooks.com/support. There, you'll find links to our new merch, the coziest t-shirts and sweatshirts, and our bookstore where we earn commission from every book you buy. You can also leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show. Again, go to everythingcookbooks.com/support to find all the ways to show us some love. And thanks for listening.
When do you fit it all in? Because this is
question.
not a full-time job. We know that you do a lot of other things, and this is still that sort of passion project that you keep going and keep iterating on. And I know I'm looking at the Salt and Spine Substack, and it's a very beautiful, impressive, thoughtful Substack. And it looks like there's a lot of time that goes into it too, and also crafting these episodes and thinking of themes. So tell me how you fit it in.
People ask me this, and I never know a good answer because I don't know myself. I'm like, I have a day job. This is not my day job. This is still my side hustle. I have 2 little-ish kids now that did not exist when I started the podcast. So that's been an adaptation. And, it's hard to, in-person recording takes time. Like there's prep, of course, for any sort of conversation, but physically getting to our recording space at the Civic Kitchen and post-production, everything, I just somehow squeeze it all in. We do sort of operate in seasons. For a year or two in the middle there, we were just year round. Like we were putting out a new episode basically every week, 52 weeks a year. And now we try to sort of chunk it into 2 or 3 major seasons. So we'll do a spring and a fall season for sure. And sometimes we'll do like a little summer season that's a little more lighthearted or a little bit different format. So trying to think about how to sort of structure the editorial calendar in a way that is manageable and that we're not, having to put things out the day after we record them and can sort of put things in the queue and stack it up. So it's hard to fit it in though. Yeah. But I appreciate that.
You mentioned prepping for episodes, and what does that look like?
I mean, I always read the book from cover to cover. Yeah. And sometimes an author will be surprised. They're like, "You really read the book? You you noted this like note on a recipe," but it's important to me to really sort of understand the book that we're talking about. I don't read a lot of other coverage of the author. I try not to read a lot of other coverage or listen to other interviews that they may have done. I kind of try to avoid being influenced by what another podcast host has asked them or other topics of conversation. Sometimes I will, if it's a person who's had a lot of media coverage. Sometimes it's helpful to know, like, am I just going to be asking all the same things that the past 3 interviews they've done have focused on? So sometimes I will, but really, it's spending a lot of time with the book, looking for interesting topics of conversation. We always start by talking about the author's career and sort of how they came to becoming a cookbook author or a chef. And then we always play a game. So we kind of have a structure to our interviews too. So it's
the game is hard. Yes. Tell us about the game.
People do think the game is hard, and I a couple authors have like spun it around on me and been like, what would you do? And I'm like, oh gosh, this is hard. I'm so sorry.
I should have done
it's
that.
It's fun though. I like the game. It's fun, but it's tricky.
Fun. And I forget when we implemented that. It wasn't there at the beginning, but now we do it every episode. And we have this board game. It's called Competition Kitchen. I think it was a Kickstarter a long time ago. And it basically is like a board game version of Chopped, right? They have like themes and different secret ingredients and things, and we just borrow graciously the ingredient cards from the deck and come up with a different game for each guest that sort of connects to their body of work or the cookbook or what we're talking about, and they can draw different ingredients, and we ask them what they might make, and sometimes things come very easily to authors and they sound very delicious. Sometimes people struggle and they're like, I would never eat that. And I'm like, that's okay. We don't have to, it's just imaginary. But it is fun. And I think people look forward to hearing how different authors sort of approach the challenge of the game.
Right. Some of them are probably a little tricky if it's like botarga and gummy bears, exactly. And I don't know, spelt. It might be a little bit harder than some of the other combinations. I don't know if that's a combination that exists in that deck.
I think it's pretty close. Yeah, the gummy bear one is the one people dread. I mean, Claire Saffitz was like, I think she drew gummy bears and she was cool as a cucumber about it. She's like, just melt them. Like, we'll do something.
Smart.
But people get really scared by the gummy bear card. And there is a lot of luck, right? You might draw that combination that Kate, you just shared, or you might draw like something that just totally naturally goes together and is like a classic dish already. So there's a little bit of luck in there too.
What makes a good interview? I mean, are there certain people who just maybe naturally have a conversational tone, but are there certain sort of universal things that go into a good podcast interview?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things. I think putting the guest at ease is really important. That's why I love in-person interviews. I think it's a lot easier to do that if you don't have a rapport with somebody already. I try to think of it as a conversation, but like very much a guided conversation. So, I'm a journalist by training, and I worked as a journalist. And still, when I started these interviews, like I prepped way too much. And the very first person we ever recorded with was James Siabut, the Oakland chef, and his book Hawker Fare. And I I hadn't done podcast recording. I'm like, this is a great interview. And I looked, and we'd been talking for like an hour and 45 minutes.
Oh,
I hadn't even realized. I'm like, I'm so sorry. And he was lovely and gracious. And then I was like, okay, so paying attention to time is another important aspect of an interview. So there is sort of that tension as the interviewer of like, how do you have some of these deeper conversations? We want it to be a little bit more than just surface level without going too deep that like you run out of time, right? And how do you keep the conversation flowing while keeping it conversational? So it's a bit of a skill, and I think it takes a lot of practice, but I think putting people at ease certainly helps with that. Not being too wedded to like the prep work that I've done and trying to follow the conversation a little bit, which has been something I've tried to get a lot better at over the course of these interviews too. Is I know there's certain things we want to talk about, but how do we sort of follow the flow naturally and try to weave those things in is really important. So those are sort of like the two things I would say. Yeah.
You're able to listen to the answers that your guest, provides. And if that changes the direction of the conversation, be able to go with it, but still come back to, make sure you have your questions answered.
Right. Well, that's actually tricky. Yeah. And I think that's something that we've, as we do these more, it becomes more natural. But you're always thinking, I got to ask this next question. But then you can get so focused on that it's hard to remember to listen to what the answer is before that. And it's hard to juggle. It's definitely a skill you have to practice at. And this is now, going in from 2018. Now you seem like when I hear your voice, it just sounds so calm, cool, and collected. Like he's going to, guide us through this interview, and there's not going to be any of those like it's crashing, it's going off course. That just doesn't happen.
That's good to hear. Yeah, it doesn't usually.
I think we can all agree on the value of a good editor.
Yeah, I was going to say I take such comfort in having an editor.
So let's talk a little bit about what happens in post. You meet with your guest, maybe it ran long, you've got your questions, you tried to get the important ones answered, the guest is at ease, and then you have this recording, the raw recording. Then what happens?
We've also sort of evolved in how we approach the post editing from, when we started years ago to today. Today, we sort of treat things more as a light edit more than we used to. In the very early days, we did much more editing to the point that we would we had this really interesting 10 minutes of conversation towards the end that actually was connected to something thematically earlier. So we can like move those things around. We were much more intentional and made a lot more editorial choices about how we wanted the full episode to sound. And now we sort of treat each interview as if it were somewhat live. I think partially, to be, frank, that was for my time and sanity and
Absolutely.
Our team's sanity, right? Like we were spending so much time editing these episodes, and like if we just go in and have a great interview, like we can clean up some of the audio that needs to be cleaned up, and it cuts the production time in half, So we still do try to remove things that are sort of fluff or filler and not crucial, especially if something's running particularly long. But for the most part, we try to treat the interview as if it were mostly live.
The script really is a game changer too.
Yeah.
I actually don't know what app he uses, to tell the truth, but I had my own podcast very briefly, and I spent the first 9 episodes using the Wave edit, and it was so hard. And then I learned about the script for my last few episodes, and I was like, well, this is a very different experience. Right. So
yeah,
the light edit. I mean, we talk a lot about how audio is somewhat forgiving. I mean, we even talked about it earlier in this conversation, and that you want to convey the conversation. And I think people who listen to a lot of podcasts, I know I do, I consume a lot of audio. I expect a certain, natural rhythm to a conversation, and sometimes conversations meander and they come back. And as long as it's, the quality's decent and it's interesting,
Yeah, exactly. And every guest is different too, right? And that's something I learned pretty early on too. You have guests who give very short answers, and you're like, okay, and part of that is not in the post, right? Part of that is in the actual interview process of being able to elicit more and keep the conversation flowing. And then you have guests who are really long-winded. So you have to be intentional, I think, about that in the moment, right? Of like, how do we sort of keep the conversation moving, or like, how do we cut it off a bit? That does save you a lot in the post too, if you can just do it in real time.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think what's also great, just thinking about audio formats, is that everybody can have their own angle. Like Salt and Spine has a very specific angle. You're going behind the scenes of who the person is who made the book, what it was like to make the book, the inside sort of scoop into who they are, and the project itself. And it seems to me that there's more interest in what really happens, how do cookbooks really get made. And I feel like our podcast, we're kind of complementary because we don't talk about the same things. Even if we had the same author on, I feel like we're going to go in different directions. It's almost like a cookbook needs an angle. If anyone's thinking of creating their own podcast, you just need an angle. There's plenty of room, but you need to get your angle. So I think that's something that's kind of interesting too. I'm thinking, I bet there's people listening who are thinking about starting a food-related cookbook or whatnot related podcast. I'm wondering if you had like words of wisdom for them, like things to think about before launching, or whether it's right for them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I think your point on having an angle is a big one, right? Like understanding what the focus is. And that's why it took me a year to launch the podcast. I could have just hit go, but I spent a lot of time thinking about what the focus would be and that it wouldn't be too open-ended. And, how do I'm not a cookbook author. I'm not a professionally trained chef. So like, what's my relationship to all of these guests? How does that translate to the episodes? So I think really just spending some time thinking about what's the focus, what's the angle, who are you, and what do you bring to the table? For me, I don't play dumb by any means. Like I'm a very informed home cook and I've spent a lot of time with cookbooks, but I don't try to position myself as an expert. I don't come to the conversation in that way. I position myself more as a facilitator, a curious person who wants to learn from these authors. Somebody else who's, listening and starting something might be like a preeminent expert on cookbook publishing and they can bring that to the table, right? But just being aware of how I think as a host you bring yourself to the space, because to be frank, the hosts make so much of the show. And I've heard a lot of feedback from people who I think appreciate that I'm not a know-it-all host. They exist on, not so much on food podcasts, maybe a little bit, but more so on other podcasts.
I was thinking politics podcasts might be pretty brutal that way.
Exactly. They dominate the conversation. So I was very intentional about that. So I think thinking about what you as an individual or as the host of a potential podcast bring to the table is really important. And podcasting is just, it exploded. People still are really into podcasts. So there's a lot of competition. And I think it's cooled down a little bit in terms of like everybody wanting to start one or trying to start one. It's still very much a medium that people are attentive to, that people consume. And so understanding like how you relate to what else is out there. For me, like when I was starting this, there were like 2 other cookbook podcasts. And I was like, there's, out of 500,000 or however many existed at the time, I'm like, that's nothing. So knowing that niche, I think is really crucial too.
I'm so curious about that year. Well, that you spent a year planning this sort of blows my mind too. But I'm very impressed by that. But if you were to go back and look at that plan, how would it compare to what Salt and Spine is today?
Oh, that's a great question. I think it would hold up pretty well. I think partially that's why I was able to launch in the way that we did. And I kind of wanted to launch with a bang, right? I wanted Jacques and Nigella, and, we record at the Civic Kitchen Cooking School in San Francisco, and they had just opened. And so having that, it's like, I'm happy to share it with you. It's like a 25-page proposal with, logos and names and concepts of different segments and everything. I walked in there too with nothing to show. And I'm like, can I just like take a lot of your time? They need to make money, right? I'm like, can I just steal your space for hours at a week to like record conversations with authors? And they graciously said yes. And then, I think they were like beside themselves too. And I'm like, and I'm bringing Jacques Pepin tomorrow.
That's cool.
That's amazing.
So that was your idea to create a studio in the front of Civic Kitchen.
Yes. I knew I wanted to record these conversations in person. I didn't, at the time I was like living in a little apartment that I didn't feel like I really wanted to invite people over to. I thought about all these options, and they had just opened. They had an opening feature in Eater, and I was looking at it. They have a beautiful cookbook library right in the front of the space, and there's a stunning picture of it in that Eater piece, and it just clicked. I was like, well, that's the perfect backdrop for a cookbook podcast. They've been amazing partners ever since. So yeah, but it's held up for the most part. The vision we had 5-6 years ago is pretty true to what we produce today still.
I love that how it's like mutually beneficial too.
Yeah. And it's a great space because they're a cooking school for home cooks. So we've done a number of live shows there because they have the infrastructure to do it. They have a full working kitchen. So we did a really fun live show with Allison Arevalo from Homeroom Restaurant here in the Bay Area. And we did a pasta in a podcast. It was super fun, family style salads, pastas. And then we sat down and had a conversation while people ate in that space. So it's a great relationship to have because we can do so much with the space. We host an annual cookie swap there with cookbook authors, demoing some holiday cookies. One year we had over 1,000 cookies that people had brought and were swapping and exchanging. And somebody brought dog biscuits and didn't label them. So somebody almost cracked a tooth. But it's a lot of fun. So
it's a lot of community too around it. And the live cooking segments, those also probably take a lot of work.
Yeah. We've played with those at different points. When we started, Allison Sullivan, our then producer, and I would cook from each book together in my home kitchen and produce an audio segment. We had like Alon Shaya, and I remember making his falafel, which I make to this day. It's an incredible recipe. And then we brought a kitchen correspondent on for a few years right before the pandemic. Sarah Varney is her name. She's now based on the East Coast, and she works for NPR and PBS and produces a lot of audio and video content. And for several years, she was sort of our kitchen correspondent, and she would go out and cook with people out in the world from these cookbooks. So it takes a lot of work. So we're trying to figure out what version 3 of bringing that to life is. And I'm really interested in video if I can find time and energy and capacity to tackle it. But yeah, how to we have these in-depth, deep conversations with authors, how to then bring the recipes and the food to life in a way too.
Absolutely. I know video is always that thing where you're right. You have to have the right camera angle, everything. It's so much harder than they make it look on TikTok.
Yeah.
If authors come on, and this, I think a lot of our listeners, is there a way, if an author appears on a podcast, is there a way for them to get a bigger bump from that beyond just doing the interview, to maximize the impact of that?
That's the hope. I mean, the hope is book sales, right? For any author. So, we focus a lot on the book. We have featured recipes from the book that we always do with each episode to give people a sense of it. So, we don't really have hard numbers to show.
But is there something from an author's end that they could do to even help that?
Yeah, I mean, I think coming really prepared to an interview is helpful. I mean, obviously authors know their work and they know their book, but being ready for the types of conversations that we have just produces better content. So it's going to perform better. And we put a lot of our audio clips on social media too. So those, the better those are, the better they'll perform, which just helps in terms of exposure for the author. That's partially why we've tried to figure out how to have live events, how to do all these other sort of community building things, is how do we make it more beneficial for the author in addition to this nice interview that we put out into the world. We, for about a year during the pandemic, did virtual cookbook clubs. So every month we brought an author who had been on the show. You could purchase a ticket to cook with them on Zoom. And then we kind of hit the phase where people were zoomed out and we're okay, let's take a break from this. So we're trying to figure out what the next version of the cookbook club looks like too, right? But that was something too, where we were hearing from authors they want to engage with our community, the Salt and Spine community, more. Being a guest on the show is great, but then, you could come and actually, as a listener, be able to ask them questions on Zoom, cook along with a recipe that they chose. So yeah, I think in terms of what the author can do, coming prepared, being there and helping us produce great content, and then just being open to creative ideas for how to leverage all of that.
Mm-hmm.
I know we talked a little bit about how there's a lot of food podcasts, but which ones do you think we could use more of?
That's a good question. There are a lot of food podcasts. I would like to see more food podcasts that focus on regional or international cuisines that don't get a lot of attention. I think there's a lot of podcasts that are extensions of food media, whether explicitly, right? Like they're produced by a major food magazine, or they just kind of in format and style and content mirror a lot of what we see in food media. So, I think Whetstone is a great example of a company who is producing really innovative food podcasts, right? They're going deep on an ingredient or a production process or a style of cooking. Even like the Milk Streets of the world. I don't listen to a ton of Milk Streets podcasts, but like the video content they do, I would like to see some of that type of content where they go to some of these other countries and learn about their cuisine from cookbook authors who produced books related to that cuisine. And some of that I think translates to their audio work, but these sort of deeper and more niche dives, I don't see a lot of that. I also think like podcasting on the whole is just like, and I say this as a white male, an industry that's like got a lot of white men in it. And so like having more people of color who are hosting podcasts, having more women who are hosting podcasts, having non-white male voices, I think is really important. So I'm always happy to see when there's podcasts that are centering those voices. And it's something we were really intentional about too. I spent most of my career in progressive politics. Like I was very focused on ensuring we weren't just featuring white men from the beginning, and we check in on that very regularly. So
those are really wise words to share. And I think anybody who wants to maybe explore what it would be like to have a podcast can listen to this episode, listen to all your content, and also just think about, we talk a lot about how to make a cookbook proposal. And I'm thinking I learned a lot about how to make a podcast proposal, even if it's just for yourself. Create your business plan, do all the brainstorming and, play around. Audio is forgiving. It just might take a little time to find your footing. This was such a fun conversation, Brian. I wish we were all in person at Civic Kitchen so we could share a bite all together as a group, but it was a delight to pick your brain and hear more about how you got into food and how you created and keep creating Salt and Spine. Just before we leave, tell us a little bit about the episodes you have going on this fall.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for inviting me. It was such an honor to get your email to join you on the show. And I remember when you all launched the podcast, and I was so excited because I'm like, this is a great concept. And I had that thought that we're not competitors, because when I saw what you were doing, right, I'm like, we complement each other so nicely. Our fall season's really exciting. We have Dan Pelosi, Grossi Pelosi coming up. We have Deb Perlman for the first time, Smitten Kitchen, her more recent book that came out spring, I want to say. She's in our fall season. We just aired a great episode with Frankie Gaw, who wrote First Generation, which is a really stunning book. Hetty McKinnon, we've had on the show before, but she's back for the first time in person, which was a real joy. James Park and his Chili Crisp book was a lot of fun to talk with him, an entire book about Chili Crisp. So, and a couple fun live shows. I think I've mentioned a couple of them already, but, we did this Mill Valley live show with the Mill Valley Public Library on the state of California cooking. We did this really cool show at Hog Island Oyster Company. So some fun live shows that people can tune in for as well.
That little virtual audio vacation to, right. Beautiful Tamales Bay or Mill Valley.
Exactly. And we always do a baking week as well. So stay tuned in November for some interviews with some of the more interesting baking authors this fall.
We will. Thanks again so much, Brian. And we'll have all the things we talked about in the show notes for anyone to check it out. This has been a lot of fun.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you all.
Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. For more episodes and ways to contact us, go to our website, everythingcookbooks.com. You can find more episodes on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your audio. If you like what you hear, please leave us a review. It really helps. Any book mentioned in the show can be found on our affiliate page at bookshop.org. Thanks, as always, to our editor, Abby Cirquitella. And until next time, keep on writing, reading, and cooking.